Hello, peoples, and welcome to Esoteric Cinema, the program where we take films and discuss the hell out of them. My name is Jason Peters, and with me, as always, is the man who once forgot his entire stand-up comedy routine and accidentally ended up inventing improv, Mr. Ryan Seabold.
Ooh, what's up, Jason? How's it going, buddy?
Doing well. I am so excited to talk about the next film in our war series. Second film we got. It is a doozy. What you got for us, sir, for a description?
For the second entry into our mini-series covering classic war films, we are skipping ahead to 1979 for Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. The movie takes place in 1970 during the height of the Vietnam War. We join Captain Willard, played by Martin Sheen, who is brought back from leave for a special mission to take a ragtag group on a patrol boat upriver to find and kill Colonel Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando. Kurtz has reportedly gone mad and taken to the deepest jungles of Cambodia with local tribespeople who see him as a god. Now our small crew will go on a hallucinogenic adventure with one wild situation after another. This film is of course directed by the great Francis Ford Coppola, is based on the novella Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and the making of this film is perhaps as entertaining and wild as the film itself. Shooting in the Philippines, the film was bogged down with delays, including a civil war and monsoons. The crew went a bit nutty, drugs aplenty, and a documentary was made covering all of this. But Jason, before I get too deep into it, I've got to ask you, did this film smell like victory, or did it leave you with the horror?
Horror. Ryan, I'm going to be happy to tell you right here in my opening statement. Do also want to let everybody know we are reviewing Apocalypse Now Final Cut. I'm here to tell you this is a war film unlike any other. While it features plenty of genre staples such as military craft and infantry and weapons and ammunition and all that, it also features examinations of troubled psychologies and moral quandaries amidst a surreal, psychedelic backdrop that is both fascinating and hallucinatory. This is a Homeric odyssey, a journey upstream that takes us to unique destinations featuring unique characters, chief among them being Robert Duvall's Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, Marlon Brando's Colonel Kurtz, and Martin Sheen's Captain Willard, with a special shout out to Dennis Hopper, who I thoroughly enjoyed as the journalist on Kurtz's compound. Vittorio Storaro's cinematography is vibrant and captures the dizzying mayhem of war alongside the slow sensibilities of the river, while Francis Ford Coppola's visual genius is on full display, with no shortage of sophisticated camera movements, unique montages, and fascinating sets. This film is the result of a talented filmmaker at the height of his abilities, executing at the highest level. I absolutely adore this film and recommend it as highly as I can. Ryan, how about you, sir?
For starters, it's my understanding that two things are happening simultaneously in this movie. You've got a script written by John Milius, loosely based on a book, and then you've got Coppola, who's pot committed as hell in the Philippines, trying to find out where the real story is as he slowly but surely loses his marbles and descends into madness. The result is magnificent. I'm not breaking any ground here by saying this is one of the greatest films ever made. It's rare that madness and genius cross paths in such a Venn diagram like this, though some of Herzog's work comes to mind. I'll say the one thing that did surprise me, though, was that though this was a film that took place surrounded by war, it was more grounded in a film noir genre for me. You have the anti-hero sent on an ill-fated mission, narrating the whole time, coming across various characters and ne'er-do-wells as he pulls back the layers to find clues and answers. I've got to say the approach to the story made me love it all that much more. The sepia-soaked cinematography by Vittorio Storaro made the most horrific moments somehow beautiful. And as a sound recordist and engineer of 20 years myself, let me tell you that the sound mix on this was so good, and we're going to get into that here shortly. If I counted correctly, IMDb lists over 50 audio technicians that have worked on this over the various edits, and the final cut lets all that hard work rip. Jason, this movie was insane in the best possible way, and I'm so glad I'm finally letting myself envelop myself in all that was and is Apocalypse Now.
Absolutely. So let's start by discussing the direction and visual language of Francis Ford Coppola and how that works to separate this film from other war films like it. So right off the bat, I think this is one of those films that's entirely of its director's DNA. You know, Coppola's had a roller coaster of career, but whatever you think of his movies, you have to admit that he is an interesting guy. I think the film works emotionally and intellectually. It's got this like unique blend of action and philosophy and psychedelia, and I would even argue compassion. You know, there's that great scene towards the beginning of the film where Willard's drunk and, you know, we see him howling and he shatters this mirror with his bloodied fist, and We see Fishburne's character later, Clean that is, where he's ceremonially laid to rest on the plantation after he gets like gunned down. And so, there's a lot of instances where there's this like surprising heart almost to the proceedings. Like I said, a compassion for all of these people who might be a little bit wayward or lost in this crazy war that's going on.
Yeah. So
we've got this crazy philosophical stuff going on over here, but we've also got these like really just sort of traditionally well done action scenes, like all the scenes with Kilgore, right? They're all just sort of lively and chaotic. We've got so many crafts and people just filling up all parts of the frame. The Flight of the Valkyries segment, right? That's a classic for a reason. And, even down to the fact that they're using like real tigers in the jungle to like hunt these soldiers. There's so many aspects of this film that's like just big traditional Hollywood war entertainment. And that works surprisingly just as well when juxtaposed against so many of those smaller, quiet, more hallucinatory moments. So did you find that as well, that it was almost like a film that managed to exist on two different sides of the spectrum, but still somehow work?
Yeah, I mean, it's rare that you get both large, big budget Hollywood film and thought-provoking indie.
Yeah, exactly.
In the
right?
same kind of movie, right? Like usually you would have one or the other. Like I kind of teed up in my opening statement the works of Werner Herzog, which,
yes,
you look at Aguirre or Fitzcarraldo or some of these other films, and their descents into madness in the jungle and very thought-provoking and heady. But to actually have a fleet of Philippine helicopters, to really flesh it out. The camera's moving all around. You're getting all these different perspectives. The gunfire, the explosions, the huge blankets and curtains of napalm fire along the coastline. It's just absolutely bonkers. But it's all grounded in these very little. I really love that you used. Kind of referenced Homer in the Odyssey in your opening statement as well, because that's what it felt like to me as well, is almost like, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, by the Coens.
Yeah, sure.
Just that we're kind of going from side quest to side quest. It felt very side questy to me, that we're just kind of going into all these little vignettes and seeing what is happening over here. And now we're over here and we're going to meet these people and what the war has done to them and how this is impacting them and so on. But we're with this ragtag group all along the way as we progress, once our journey begins upriver, and all the way through to, like you said, the French refugees on the plantation that don't want to leave, and the bridge construction scene, and all of that is just absolutely bonkers. But it never felt cheap or minimalized, especially with the adversity that they were encountering when you find out, how the film was made and all the hardships they had to overcome. You would think that would have stifled some of these larger set pieces and said, let's scale back. We need to do this small. We're going to shoot this tight. Coppola said, no, we're just going to stay another 100 days and do this the right way and stick to the plan. So absolutely crazy.
Yeah. And you mentioned, the Odyssey, and I think it does present a sort of interesting structure, because there's a lot of unique characters, like I had mentioned in my statement, but none of them are consistent throughout the film. This isn't something where Kilgore is going to, pop up at the plantation, or he's going to show up at the very end on the compound like, hey, what's up, guys? We really just go from like one destination and sort of one, I guess, archetypal character, or one character that is sort of like, in a way, representative of that specific area. And then, we then go on along the river, and then we go to the next area, and we're never going to see that person again. Once we leave Kilgore, we never come back to him. And the same is true of the plantation, the USO show, all of these places. So it's a pretty interesting structure. And one of the things I also really appreciated is, again, talking about how this is a creation of its creator, its director, Francis Ford Coppola. One of the aspects of the structure in doing that, having him go from place to place, is he wanted to create this structure wherein each location that he went to was almost getting further detached from the present time. So like each place that they go to, they become a little bit more primitive and, revert, 20, 30 years back to sort of the way things were. We see this when, they get to the USO show, and then, when they go to the plantation, that's very much sort of, inspired by the 50s. By the time we get to the compound, it's almost like an Aboriginal sort of compound, especially with all of the locals and the natives that are performing, these rituals and all of that. So it was an interesting regression, rather than progression, in terms of the way that the story develops.
Yeah, it also provided a very unique opportunity for Coppola to, in each of these sequences, to say something a little different about war, about humanity, about these characters and who they were. So from the opening sequence, like you stated, with Sheen, kind of drunk and punching the mirror and going mad, we see what state he's in mentally and what the war has done to him so far. And then, you got the USO show, you've got Kilgore, you've got the plantation, and each time we stop along the way, the bridge scene, we kind of settle in there, and it takes then Coppola has a minute to breathe and say, okay, we're here for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it is. This is my chance to say this or make my statement about this or change my characters a little bit. And then we're going to move them along to the next moment. And then that's going to change them this way, or we see them degenerate that way. To the point where when we start with Kilgore, the new recruit is a professional surfer from California. He's catching shit. Kilgore's gone mad. He's trying to get him out on the waves. Let's get him on the waves, blah, blah, blah. Perfect break. These are our waves. But then by the time we end, that guy's gone totally bonkers. He's taken acid at the bridge scene, hallucinating. And then by the time we get to the encampment, Colonel Kurtz's encampment at the end, he's in total bonkers mode, face paint, joined the villagers by the end. I mean, Sheen has to kind of get him out of the crowd and say, come on, you idiot, come with me, at the final moments of the movie, because he's joined them, And so we kind of see that not only de-evolution of each scene, but also the de-evolution of our characters as well, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. And I also did really appreciate the ending, again, sort of being an idea of Coppola's, because the ending that was written in John Milius's original script was actually very different. It was a very sort of traditional battle sequence where what ends up, Martin Sheen's character, Captain Willard, ends up joining Colonel Kurtz and basically fighting against the U.S. Army, who's like gone in to attack Colonel Kurtz's compound. And part of the reason that they ended up changing that is because when Brando showed up, he was actually way heavier than he was supposed to be. Like in the script, he's this Colonel Kurtz is this big fit guy and he's rough and tumble. And, this sounds like they drew him up kind of like the bad guy from the Avatar movie.
Nothing's over while I'm breathing.
Like a cliche of like that, let's go, blah, blah, blah. Francis was like, look, we can't pass this version of Kurtz off with, a guy that looks and acts and feels like this. So he kind of knew, but the thing is he wasn't able to figure out the ending before they started shooting. So he just started shooting and was like, well, I guess we're going to stumble across the right ending, and just knew that it wasn't going to be this big battle. And so kept experimenting. And the fact that he was able to sort of end up where they did, it's crazy that he didn't have that worked out ahead of time, because it feels like the natural, organic resolution of this story and the way that it's been presented. It is violent, but it's also kind of hypnotic and it's surreal. And we've got, the intercut of Colonel Kurtz's murder with the sacrifice of this cattle that's going on with this Aboriginal, event, so to speak.
Ceremony or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And so like all of that just works so perfectly at, coming from the film that we've gotten up to that point, to do some traditional big battle, with helicopters and planes and bombs and stuff, like just would have, doing Platoon or something like that just would have felt like completely inorganic to the movie.
No, I totally agree. I think there's two ways to play that character, the Colonel Kurtz character. And one is exactly like you said, the fit, rough and tough guy that is drunk on his own power. And his own hubris. But then the other way is to portray it as like Hedonism Bot from Futurama.
I apologize for nothing.
Which, is also drunk on his own power and hubris, but, in a different form. And so I kind of saw Colonel Kurtz's character as more of a large gluttonous god that is, kind of been spoiled by his own seclusion.
Absolutely, Ryan. Now, let's discuss the performances, because I think a huge part of what makes the film work is the stellar contributions of the cast in creating these unique and memorable characters, First and foremost, we have Martin Sheen, who was not only not Coppola's first choice, but wasn't even the first actor cast in the role. Famously, Harvey Keitel was initially cast, and as they were going, Coppola realized, like, hey, I think I need a more passive character, just the way that this story is developing. And I personally, I think it was a really good decision to bring Sheen in. I think he brings a fragility and a damaged psyche to the role that Harvey Keitel probably wouldn't have. We see him constantly drinking and smoking, and he's like always seemingly trapped in his head to the point that the only times we really hear him talk is in this narration,
I think in his face too, just physically as in his stature, he looks more vulnerable and inquisitive and curious than Harvey Keitel, which maybe would have come across as more tough and rugged.
Yeah.
Which at first glance is what you want, from a colonel or a war chief or general or something like that, captain. So, but as you progress through this story, you realize, his curiosity and his vulnerability had so much more layers to this character. And I really appreciated Sheen's casting.
Absolutely, yeah. Another incredible casting, Robert Duvall, incredible as the Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore. Specifically, I think the thing about him it was like the physical mannerisms that he brings to the role, like that are just so specific, like especially his walk. Like that character's walk is one of the most distinctive and telling walks of any character in cinema. Like you could just pick up one of those Kilgore scenes blind, press play, watch him walk for like 3 seconds across the horizon and know exactly who that character is,
Sure, I agree.
And I thought that was really impressive the way that he did that.
Yeah, and all the little moments, like when he's walking into the village upon his entrance and he's throwing the death cards down, it's like, I did this kind of deal. He gets a lot of credit for the line, I love the smell of napalm in the morning, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
It smells like victory, and that whole diatribe he goes on. But more than that, I loved his very calm and stoic performance during that delivery. There's explosions going on behind him. There's death, there's chaos and carnage, and he's just not moved by any of it. He's just, steadfast and delivering these lines of confidence. And I thought that was really great as well. When the line started, again, having not seen this film before, very recognizable, and I cued right in on it. But because I knew the line, I just was watching his delivery of it. And I thought that was leaps and bounds more impactful.
Marlon Brando's Kurtz, that's an interesting character, I think, largely because of how immensely he looms over the entire proceedings throughout the film. But then he's only got like 15 minutes of screen time at the very end.
I was shocked by that. Yeah.
It's really strange. I think that, I do think that it was a good decision to include the audio recordings of him just kind of rambling and getting a sense of sort of this insanity and madness early on in that Harrison Ford scene, And I think that sort of like that stays with us over time, and people are just constantly talking about Colonel Kurtz. He's the object. But then, even when we get to his compound, it takes about, 20, like we get a little brief moment with him, but it really isn't until the very end. So it was interesting to know, how large, again, his character loomed with such minimal screen time.
Yeah, it's more like the concept or legend of Colonel Kurtz is the antagonist of this film more than the character itself. So, because by the time you get there, he is a very minor part of what is a very long movie.
Yeah.
So, but the gravity that Marlon Brando brings to this role and the way it was shot, because even when he does show up, he's mostly obfuscated in shadow and kind of hidden in the darkness. And, you get like a small slash of light across his face.
Yeah.
So even after he's revealed, he's still not entirely revealed. It's still leaning heavily on all that lore that the film has built up over time. And though he's delivering those lines very impactfully and Brando crushes these moments, I would say his performance is very downplayed, very, monotone, which makes it all the more haunting.
So that was actually a result of the fact that Coppola and Brando could not decide on the character. Like Francis Ford Coppola's vision for him, Brando didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be the traditional sort of like, I get carried around on a cot and, get fanned by palm leaves and all this sort of stuff.
Sure.
He wanted him to be more like brooding sort of. So basically at a certain point, I think it was like they only had Brando for 3 weeks contractually, and they had gone through like a week of workshopping and trying to figure out character and could not come to a conclusion. So at some point, like Coppola was just like, dude, we just need to get something on film. So like, just go in the shadows and ad-lib, just improv and make up stuff. So like that, what Brando's saying that's so effective wasn't even written on page. That was just him like spitballing and going off the top of the dome. A very polished dome, by the way. But so it's really interesting to know that, again, you know, for this ending that works so well, that seems so organic, like they had no clue what they were doing. They were just putting something down because they had to get something to justify his salary before he took off.
Sure.
So it's very
What's funny is, you know, you talk about the, you know, carried around on a cot and being, you know, we got that performance out of Brando out of Isle of Dr. Moreau. He kind of did the antithesis to this of what, you know, you would imagine what Colonel Kurtz was going to be when he's waiting there. He wasn't that, but he did get to do that later on in his career and give another iconic performance. Probably, maybe one of the only iconic things about that movie was his performance. But I would say too that we got a very similar downplayed performance out of Brando in The Godfather, you know? So, you know, what's scarier when you show up to someone and he's losing his mind and yelling, you know, Al Pacino and Scarface style, or someone that's very calculating and calm, you know, and looks you dead in the eyes, or even looking down and, you know, has lost his mind and going through all these, you know, horrors that they've been through over the time that they spent in Cambodia. So I think that performance is actually scarier to me in those moments than if he was bombastic and over the top and, you know, chaotic and yelling and you know, accusatory and pointing the finger. I think that would have played less haunting to me than what he actually gave us. Yeah, definitely. Now, the editing of this film is a feat in and of itself, regardless of which of the versions you're discussing. Sure. The fact is that they ended up shooting literally 1 million feet of film when all was said and done on this production. And so because of that, it actually took 4 editors to come together and ultimately make the original cut, which was 2.5 hours, not even talking about the 3-hour final cut, and 2 years of editing time, which is crazy. Yeah. So, and then, you know, we've got the editors are Richard Marks, Gerald Greenberg, Lisa Fruchtman, and then, of course, the great Walter Murch, who, you know, famously on this film was the first ever credited sound designer in the history of movies, which is crazy, you know? Yeah. I mean, if it's okay, I'd like to jump in and talk about that. Absolutely, please do. Again, as a sound recordist and sound engineer for over 20 years in my personal career, that was something that stood out like gangbusters to me when I was watching this film is that I was listening to this film. I have a great stereo home theater system, whatever, that I was listening to it on, and I'm just surrounded and enveloped by the war that I'm like dropped in the middle of. I was getting a very similar experience as Martin Sheen's character, and that just was something I wanted to research and look into, and I was shocked to see that the sound department had perhaps the most credits of anyone on the film, aside from the cast, of course. So Coppola was inspired by the work of a Japanese composer by the name of Isao Tomita, who was an early pioneer of the synthesizer. Remember, this is the mid to late 70s, so Moog synthesizers were all the rage, but the contracts for the record labels squashed all that. So Coppola went back to the studio when they got back to the States, and he started with an orchestration by his father, Carmine Coppola. Carmine Coppola was a pretty well-known at the time composer and orchestrator, so he went ahead and started scoring the whole film. Then they took that score and they modified it by a series of 5 synthesizer professionals. Coppola locked everybody in a room and they went ahead and banged out the score to this film. So that's where you get all those weird synthetic kind of hallucinatory wow, kind of guttural sounds that are super trippy. And as you move through the film, he started to add in percussion, and he hired Grateful Dead's Mickey Hart, one of the percussion players and drummers for the Grateful Dead, to really add in all those tribal percussions that, as we move into Colonel Kurtz's encampment and all of that, really start to bring all that about and make it even more haunting, and add some chaos to all of that synthetic stuff from the Moog synthesizers. And then all that was brought together, like you said, by Walter Murch's multi-track quadraphonic sound editing. Absolutely bonkers stuff here. This is in the early days of Dolby. and quadraphonic sound. Before that, you had stereophonic sound. And so it's all just what you could fit on the film strips and how it was able to be displayed in theaters. Remember, theaters didn't have surround sound back then. So that, when you were able to catch quadraphonic sound and surround sound, they were able to put the helicopters behind you and so forth. And that's all the same great stuff we get to this day. And right down to the Foley sound editing that Walter Murch was able to bring about. I don't know if you saw this, but they brought the patrol boat, the actual patrol boat that was brought from the Philippines and used in the film. They brought that back to the studio, and Walter Murch used that for all the Foley sound. And again, like you said earlier, Murch is credited as the first to receive the title of sound designer for this movie. So yeah, as a sound guy myself, this was like absolutely chef's kiss filet mignon caviar to me. I loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was also interesting because as far as you had mentioned that Francis's father, Carmine, did a lot of the scoring. And then in addition to that, he actually did all of the flute playing on it. So if you actually listen, in addition to a lot of those synth sounds that you're talking about, you'll notice a lot of what they call solo flute, which is exactly what it sounds like.
Sure.
And yeah, his father was a really accomplished flautist. And so he actually recorded all of the flute parts. So all of the flute that you hear in the movie is his father. So really interesting there. And also just really, effective use of the doors in that opening scene, right? Obviously the opening is, very iconic. We all know, but it's actually really interesting how it came together. I didn't know this, but Francis Ford Coppola went to UCLA film school during college, and he went when the Doors were all going to UCLA film, and they were all film students. I didn't realize this. So he was actually in classes with all of the Doors. And so obviously this is something that stuck with him when he was trying to think about what he was going to do for the opening. He happened to be around a barrel that was full of all of this like footage that had just been randomly shot. And as you had mentioned, they used 5 cameras to cover the napalm scene. And he just looked at the film strip from one of the cameras just rolling on that napalm drop and was like, hey, this is really good. Wouldn't it be funny if we put that song that my friends The Doors made at the end at the beginning over this part? And it was just an experiment, and it ended up working. And so once again, it comes back to that whole aspect of like, so much of this film was ultimately just Coppola experimenting, in real time, live, without really knowing what he was doing ahead of time, and just sort of stumbling into it through exploration, not through like dumb luck, but just through experimenting and trying things out and being willing to go through the process. And so the fact that so many of these iconic moments came about as almost experiments is really wild.
Yeah, I guess based on my research, I found that he started with as like a template using the Doors throughout the entire movie. Oh, wow. And Walter Murch said that it was like too much.
Yeah.
It was too on the nose, too psychedelic, too trippy.
Yeah.
And it needed to be something else. And so what they ended up with was the end product was more of a, again, like the film's story, it's more of a de-evolution of your sound design as well, where it starts with the Doors and rock music, and then it goes into the synthesizers and all the deconstructed sounds. Then by the end, like you said, you're getting jungle flute from his dad, and then the Mickey Hart tribal drums and percussions by the time you get to Colonel Kurtz and Cambodia. So even audio-wise, audibly, it's kind of the de-evolution of sound, too, to get to those tribal aspects of just banging on drums and cymbals and this whole orchestration of percussion. So I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. One last quick little Murch contribution. He was the one who was responsible for coming up with that opening montage sequence of the very beginning of Martin Sheen staring up and the fan being the helicopters and all
stuff.
that. Yeah,
of course he did.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's just like, man, like so many of these iconic moments wouldn't have happened if Murch wasn't there to be like, hey, I got another idea. All right, show us your genius. That's fine. Come on.
I feel like we could do a whole film series just on the works of Walter Murch and his contributions to cinema history. He's an amazing editor, sound designer. We could call it the Murch tent.
Wonderful. Ryan, let's finish with a brief discussion of theme, which might just be the hardest part of the film to pin down. I'll ask you directly, if you had to summarize what you felt the overall messages and examinations of the film are, how would you do so?
kind of just the stripping down of the layers that we all build up around ourselves, because war really breaks you down to who you are as a person.
Sure.
So I think that what we're seeing throughout this movie is these young men. I mean, we haven't even talked about Lawrence Fishburne in this film being 14 years old,
right.
As one of the patrol boat officers going upriver to Colonel Kurtz's camp. So, you're seeing these very young men being laid bare and stripped apart and, kind of showing us who, what is humanity. That's kind of my take on it. And as you're kind of visiting these different little scenes and sequences, like you said, the USO show is showing, our ape-man self with the sexuality and the lust and what these men are willing to do. They're one step away from beating their chest, like a gorilla, and coming after these women by the end of the sequence. And
Sure.
They're jumping on the helicopter and they barely make it out unscathed. So yeah, I just kind of felt like it was pulling back those layers of the onion. The bridge sequence down the road, you've seen these young men just completely shell-shocked. They're gone, man. They're listening to Hendrix. They turn off the Hendrix. They launch that mortar up and they kill somebody, and they're wide-eyed and completely gone. So, yeah. And then our riverboat team as well, as they're getting into further, more drugs as they go upriver and all of that. So that was kind of my take on it. What about you?
I think the film at its core ultimately is an examination of the souls of men, and specifically how difficult and traumatic experiences wound us and shape us and force us to retreat into ourselves, which almost reinforces
Sure.
this cycle of darkness and negativity. We see that Kurtz has clearly retreated into himself and is guilty of committing war crimes and these acts of murder. We've got Willard, who's also retreated into himself. He escapes into fits of, alcoholism and chain smoking. And, we almost get the sense that this is a guy who doesn't have a single friend in the world, And so I think that ultimately it's, again, looking at that idea of the more that we retreat into ourselves and the more that we isolate from society, that damages us, and that has a psychic effect on us that's ultimately very damaging and very regressive. I mean, if you want to actually even take a step back and look at the Kilgore character, Kilgore's probably the happiest and most confident person in this entire movie. And he's somebody who leads men, and he's out there, and he's very expressive, and he's not ashamed of who he is. And again, you don't get the idea that Kilgore's sitting there on a bed smoking a cigarette thinking about the atrocities that he committed while he was in war. Hell no.
No.
He's got waves to go surf, man. And not only that, but also he's actually a rather heroic person. Like, he's the one who gets the moment to save the baby in the movie, when the local native comes and she's got like her child. And even though she's the enemy, he still is like, you know what? The right thing to do is take this baby, get him into the helicopter and save him, So again, I think it's more of that, like, just being honest and open with ourselves and the world, and, being a part of society and having a belief system, and all of this brings out the best in us. And it's when we brood and retreat into ourselves and isolate that all of the most negative aspects of ourselves come to light.
Yeah, for good, bad, or indifferent. And that's why the Kilgore character was really the one that led me to my answer. Because, like I said, I think that Coppola is showing us how war, something is one of the most traumatic experiences you can go through in the human experience, really strips away all the pretense and lays bare who you are and what's in your soul. And so I think we both kind of said the same thing in different ways, but that was my coming away. That's what I came away with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, also just reinforced by that title of the original work, right? Like, we have to remember that this is an adaptation of a book called Hearts of Darkness. And so, we see Willard's dark heart. We see Kurtz's dark heart. We see all these dark hearts. And so that's very much of its DNA.
Yep.
Before we wrap, is there anything else that you would like to bring up, Ryan?
I cannot believe they were able to capture as much as they did. I mean, I know it was a somewhat controlled environment of the Philippines where they shot this, but dude, tip of the hat to Vittorio Storaro. We didn't talk enough about the cinematography. absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous film showing us some very, very ugly, inhumane things. And they shot this in the worst of hardships, in the mud, fighting monsoons and typhoons, civil war down in the Philippines, the Philippines government literally taking away their helicopters mid-shoot to go fight, then bringing them back later. It's just absolutely an incredible, insurmountable feat to shoot this film. And of course, Coppola gets all the credit in the world, but tip of the hat to Storaro as well for coming away with the footage that he did. 1 million feet of it, to be exact, apparently. There's some good stuff in there somewhere. Gotta be.
Absolutely. Now, to everyone watching, before we leave you with our final star ratings, Ryan and I like to wrap up our discussion with a little segment called 3 Scenes, wherein we point out the 3 scenes we feel best summarize our overall response to the film. Positive, negative, or otherwise. Ryan, as always, my good friend, I am going to let you go first.
Well, with this being my first watch of this film, and again, to anyone watching this, I'm terribly sorry if I've lost any credibility, but I will go ahead and kick it off by saying the film's opening. I know that's kind of a cliche answer, but I do believe it tees up the emotion of the experience you're about to go through. It was something that I never experienced before, having not watched this film, so I very much really loved that intro and the emotional entrance to Martin Sheen's character in those moments, like you said earlier. Moving along, I'm going to skip way down the line to the Dulong Bridge scene. This is where all control is lost and psychedelia enters. You've got the surfer character with his little puppy. You've got the soldiers that are fighting for just to maintain any level of their ground. And as they leave, the bridge is lost and everything is just wrecked and chaotic. But that really captured me and really hit, those moments are really influential and emotional for me as well. I will add to that, lastly, the entrance into Kurtz country, where they encounter the villagers all painted in white on boats. That is such a sick scene visually. And then they get to the encampment. The set design was impeccable. But yeah, Kurtz country, absolutely phenomenal scene and entrance, just in those brief moments when they sail past all those boats down the river. How about you, Jason?
Yeah, so my first scene is, a bit of a cliche. It's the Flight of the Valkyries scene, right? It's the most referenced sequence for a reason. It's just a great mix of visuals and editing and pacing and music. And the other thing I think that kind of gets a little bit lost in that sequence is maybe it's just me, but I get a sense of satire in that scene as well, almost kind of making slight fun of just the bombast of the military and some of these supposed psychological ops that they do.
Oh, definitely.
For my second scene, I've got to go with Kurtz's murder. The execution in the shadows, cross-cut with that ritualistic sacrifice of the cattle by the tribesmen, creates a much more unsettling tone than if we had just stayed with Willard as he was murdering Kurtz the entire time outright. So I thought that was a very interesting. And then, of course, it creates arguably the best visual in the entire movie, where Martin Sheen's, head all painted up comes out of that, water very slowly and silently.
Sick.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Again,
with the steam all around him and stuff.
Yeah, it's a cliched shot for a reason. Again, everybody references it because it's amazing. And so for my third film, it would be the Willard montage at the beginning of the film. Not only sets that hallucinatory tone, but really shows us the psychological damage of Willard's character. And just that one sequence is going to entirely define him to the point that we'll carry that idea with us throughout the entirety of the movie, even when he's playing soldier and killing people,
Sure, I agree.
Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and move on to our star ratings. I don't think there's going to be any surprises here. For myself, got to go the full 5 out of 5 stars. Absolutely amazing experience. Once again, we did watch the Final Cut here. I've seen all 3 of them, and Final Cut is my recommended cut. I believe it's the best of the 3. Ryan, how about you?
Yep, going full 5 stars. This is got the reputation it deserves for a reason, and on it goes. This movie slaps. I would watch it again. Right now, this movie is awesome, and yeah,
absolutely
good stuff. 5 stars.
To all of you watching, thanks for taking part in our discussion of Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Esoteric Cinema, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to our channel right here on YouTube. For myself, Jason Peters, and my good friend Ryan Siebold, this has been Esoteric Cinema. Continue to appreciate film and enjoy the movies.